Hello everyone and welcome to this in-depth tutorial. Today we are diving into the fascinating world of creating custom exception handling and rigorously testing these custom exceptions using the powerful Mockito framework. You are about to embark on a journey that will not only strengthen your understanding of exception handling in Spring, but also equip you with the skills to ensure your applications gracefully handle unexpected situations. In a world where robust error management is crucial for any software project, mastering custom exception handling is an essential skill for developers. Whether you are building RESTful APIs, web applications, or any software system, knowing how to tailor your error responses and gracefully manage exceptions is a game changer. Before we dive in, I want to mention a couple of things. First, if you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out my previous video on global custom exception handling and testing it in Postman. You will find the link in the description below. We will be building upon that foundation in this tutorial. Secondly, if you are new to Spring Boot or haven't had the chance to explore it fully, I have also created a comprehensive Spring Boot tutorial on how to create an employee management API. It covers the basic and more. Feel free to watch that tutorial before proceeding here. With that said, let's get started with our custom exception handling and testing journey. Our journey today involves integrating logging using the powerful Logback logging framework and configuring error messages for your database interactions and input validations. We will create custom exception classes such as database exception, validation exception, and employee not found exception, each tailored to handle a specific situations gracefully. But that's not all. We will take it a step further and build a custom exception handler using Spring's controller advice and exception handler annotations. This ensures that when exceptions occurs, they are handled elegantly and clients receive informative error responses. As we progress, you will see how to throw custom exceptions in your service layer based on real-world scenarios. We will explore the inner workings of the find employee by ID method, which is designed to throw a custom exception with a meaningful database error message when an employee is not found. This tutorial is packed with practical demonstrations, code walkthroughs, and hands-on examples. By the end of it, you will have a solid grasp of custom exception handling and be well prepared to implement these skills in your own projects. So, without further ado, let's dive into the world of custom exception handling and sharpen your error management skills. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay updated with more exciting tutorials like this. Now let's get started. Now we will include the required dependencies needed for this project. We need the SLF4J API and the powerful Logback logging framework, and also we need JUnit Jupyter API, JUnit Jupyter Engine, and JUnit. Make sure to use the latest version. To do this, go to your browser and enter mvnrepository.com. The search bar enter SLF4J. Here you can see the API SLF4J API. Copy the Maven code, then paste it into your pom.xml file. Similarly, search for logback-classic, copy the code, paste it in pom.xml. These dependencies are necessary for integrating logging. Okay, now let's add JUnit Jupyter. Search for org.junit.jupyter. You will find JUnit Jupyter API and JUnit Jupyter Engine. First, let's copy JUnit API and paste it into your pom.xml file. Similarly, do the same for Jupyter Engine as well. Okay, now copy JUnit dependency as well. These dependencies are necessary for setting up JUnit test in your project. They include JUnit Jupyter API, the JUnit Jupyter Engine, and JUnit itself. Make sure to include them as they will enable you to write and run JUnit 5 tests successfully. Now it's time to build your project using MVN clean install. You can find the Maven panel on the right side. Navigate to the lifecycle section, select clean and click run. It It got built successfully. Now select install and click run again. You are seeing another successful build. We have successfully configured all the dependencies needed for our project. Now let's centralize our error messages. Maintain error messages in the property file. Example error message.properties for localization and easy management. Instead of loading these messages in your error response constructor, you can use the Spring message source to retrieve them when needed. Next, we configure our database error messages in the properties file. Let's create the database error message properties file and validation error messages properties file under resources directory under src main resources. Under here right click new file database hyphen error hyphen messages dot properties. Right click new file validation hyphen error hyphen messages dot properties. Now we will add the following error messages here in the database error messages dot properties. We have to add the following: database dot error dot not found equal to record not found in the database. Database dot error dot duplicate equal to record already exists in the database. Database dot error dot generic equal to an error occurred while accessing the database. Now go to validation error messages properties. We have to add the following: validation.error.required equal to the field is required. Next one is validation.error.email.invalid equal to invalid email address format. With the configuration in place, now let's create a custom error response class. The custom error response class is designed to structure error responses with attributes like private date timestamp, private string error code, private string error message, private string error details. Now let's define Lambo connotations such as @setter, @getter and all are constructor to simplify method generation. Let's create custom exception classes. In this tutorial, we will build upon the foundation of our previous video on global custom exception handling. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend checking it out first for context. The link is in the description box below. You may not already have the employee not found exception class. Here is an example. This employee not found exception class is a custom exception class that extends runtime exception. It accepts an error message as a parameter and passes it to the superclass constructor. This exception is thrown in specific scenarios such as when the find employee by ID method in our employee service does not find an employee with the given ID. Now let's create database exception and validation exception. Right click new class database exception. This class that extend runtime exception. Same way, copy the constructor, paste it here. Similarly, we will create validation exception class as well. Now let's create a handler class named customized response entity exception handler under the controller package to manage this custom exception. This class extends response entity exception handler and is annotated with @controller advice and @rest controller. @controller advice annotation marks the class as an exception handler advice component, and @rest controller indicates that the class will handle exception and will return responses in a restful manner. Example JSON or XML. Okay. Now let's create a handle employee not found exception method. This method with at exception handler employee not found exception annotation. This annotation specify that this method handles exceptions of type employee not found exception. The handle employee not found exception method handles employee not found exception. It takes two parameters, employee not found exception, the exception instance, and web request to access details of the current web request. Inside the method, we create an error response object with the information such as the timestamp, error message from the exception, and a description of the request. We then return a response entity with the error response and an HTTP status code of 404 not found. With this setup, when an employee not found exception is thrown in our application, Spring will invoke this method to generate an appropriate error response. The response include the error message and other relevant details from the request. Similarly, let's create handle data exception method and handle validation exception method. Let's copy paste it here. Handle database exception method handles database exception. It takes two parameters, database exception, the exception instance, and web request to access details of the current request. Inside the method, we create an error response object with the information such as the timestamp, error message from the exception, and the description of the request. We then return a response entity with the error response and an HTTP status code of 500, internal server error. Okay. Now, let's create handle validation exception method. This handle validation exception method handles validation exception. It takes two parameters, validation exception, the exception instance, and the web request. Inside the method, we create the error response object with the information such as timestamp, error message from the exception, and the description of the request. We then return a response entity with the error response and an HTTP status code of 400, bad request. Now let's go to the employee service class. Let's add validation in find employee by ID method. The find employee by ID method is a crucial part of our application. Let's break it down step by step to understand what it does. First, we perform input validation to ensure that the ID parameter is valid. We check if ID is null or less than or equal to 0. If it is, we throw a validation exception with an error message indicating that the employee ID is invalid. This step helps ensure that we are working with valid input data. Okay, now we attempt to retrieve an employee from the database using the employee repository. We call employee repository.find by employee ID of ID to search for an employee with the provided ID. This method returns an optional employee. Then we check if an employee is present in the optional using optional employee dot is present. If an employee is found, we return it using optional employee dot get method. This means we have successfully retrieved the employee from the database and we return it to the caller. If the optional does not contain an employee, it means the employee does not exist in the database. In this case, we throw on employee not found exception with an error message indicating that no employee was found with the given ID. This custom exception provides a clear and informative error message for this specific situation. Lastly, we have error handling for potential database exception. If an exception occurs while interacting with the database, example connection issue or query problem, we catch the exception and throw a database exception. This custom exception includes details about the database error, making it easier to diagnose and troubleshoot. In summary, the find employee by ID method ensures that we validate input data, perform a database query, handle both successful and unsuccessful scenarios, and provide informative error messages when needed. This robust error handling approach is crucial for a production-ready application. With these changes, we can now start writing our test cases. Let's first setting up the test environment. Let's create a service package in the test folder and the class named employee service test. Okay, this class is annotated with @extend with Mockito extension dot class. This annotation is used to integrate Mockito with JUnit 5, allowing you to use Mockito's mocking capabilities in your test. Now we will mock the dependencies we need for this test. Let's use @inject_mocks to inject a mock of employee service, private employee service, employee service. @inject_mocks annotation injects mocks into the fields of the test class. In this case, it injects a mock of the employee service, which is the class being tested. Similarly, we will define employee repository using @mock to mock. So we use @mock to create a mock instance of employee repository, @mock private employee repository, employee repository. This mock annotation creates a mock instance of the employee repository. Mocks are used to simulate the behavior of real objects, allowing you to control and verify interactions during testing. Okay, let's dive into writing our first test case. We will start by creating the test find employee by ID underscore success method and use the @test annotation. Within this method, the first step is to create a sample employee object. This is the employee we expect to be returned when we call find employee by ID later. Okay. Next, we will mock the behavior of employee repository to return this sample employee when the find employee by ID method is called. This is crucial for isolating the test and controlling the behavior of our repository. Then we will call the service method to find the employee by ID, simulating a real world scenario where we are searching for an employee. Finally, we will assert that the result we get matches the sample employee we created earlier. In summary, this test find employee by ID underscore success test method checks if the find employee by ID method in employee service successfully returns an employee when the ID is valid. Okay, now let's test the test cases. Click the green button here and click employee service test. Here you can see the test passed. Now we will start to write next test method, test find employee by ID underscore not found. But before that, let's use @spy annotation to partially mock employee service and control the behavior of specific method. @spy private employee service, employee service spy. This @spy annotation creates a spy of employee service. A spy allows you to partially mock the behavior of real object, meaning some methods will behave as usual while others can be controlled or stubbed. Okay, now let's proceed to write the test find employee by ID underscore not found method. In this test case, we are simulating the scenario where the find employee by ID method does not find an employee with a specific ID. In our case 2L, we have configured the mock behavior to return an empty optional, and we use a spy to throw a database exception when no employee is found. The test checks whether the database exception is thrown with the expected error message. In summary, this test method simulates the scenario where the find employee by ID method does not find an employee with the specific ID and ensure that it throws a database exception as expected. Okay, now let's test the test case. Click the green button here and click employee service test. Here you can see the test passed. Now we will start to write our next test method, test find employee by ID underscore invalid input. This test case covers scenarios where invalid input null or 0 ID is provided to the find employee by ID method. It uses assert throws to verify that a validation exception is thrown in both cases. Now let's test the test case. Click the green button here and click employee service test. Here you can see the test passed. Now we will start to write our next test method, test find employee by ID underscore database error. In this test case, we are testing how the find employee by ID method handles the database error. We have configured the mock behavior to throw a database exception when called the specific ID 3L. The test checks whether the method correctly throws a database exception with the expected error message. Now let's test the test case. Click the green button here and click the employee service test. Here you can see the test passed. Now we will start to write our next test method, test find employee by ID underscore other exception. This test case is designed to check how the find employee by ID method handles other unexpected exceptions. We have configured the mock behavior to throw a custom exception. Example here, database exception. When called with a specific ID 4L, the test checks whether the method correctly throws a database exception in this unexpected scenario. Okay, now let's test the test case. Here you can see the test passed. Now let's dive into the details of the test find employee by ID underscore not found test case. This test case focuses on what happens when an employee is not found. We create a spy of employee service to mock only the find employee by ID method while retaining the real implementations for other methods. We configure the mock behavior to return an empty optional and throw a database exception when no employee is found. Finally, we use asset throws to verify that the expected database exception is thrown with the correct error message. Next, we will explore and delve into the attest property source annotation by defining it in our class. The attest property source annotation is used to specify the locations of property files that contain configuration properties for your tests. In this case, it loads properties from application.properties, database error messages.properties, and validation error messages.properties. However, for these properties files to be properly utilized in your application code, you need to have the corresponding configuration in your application. In this context, it includes defining the message source config class. So if you have the attest property source annotations referencing these properties files in your test class, it implies that your application code such as the employee service class should be configured to use the message source provided by the message source config class to retrieve messages from these properties files during the regular application execution. Additionally, you need to mock the message source using @mock annotation in your employee service test class. @mock annotation creates a mock instance of message source. In this context, it is used to simulate the behavior of the message source component, which is typically responsible for obtaining error messages from properties files. By using @mock, we can control and verify the interactions with the message source during testing without invoking its actual methods. I already have this in my existing code as I am utilizing my older code base, but still allow me to guide you through this configuration class. Let's understand its purpose. The message source config class serves as a Spring @configuration class responsible for configuring a reloadable resource bundle message source bean. This bean is essential for message localization within your Spring application. So now we will see when to use. You should employ the message source when there is a need to internationalize or localize messages within your application. This entails delivering messages in different languages or personalizing messages without altering the code. Okay, now let's see the code in detail. This @configuration annotation signifies that the class encompasses bean definition and configuration settings. It forms a fundamental part of Spring Core framework, aiding in defining application context configurations. This @bean annotation is utilized to declare a method as a bean definition method. It communicates to Spring that a bean of the return type should be generated and managed by the Spring container. This reloadable resource bundle message source is a Spring class that facilitates the loading of messages from resource bundles while offering reloading capabilities. It enables the modification of message properties without requiring the application to be restarted. This set base name of class path database error messages. This specify the base name of the message source, indicating the location of message properties file. In this instance, it points to the database error messages within the class path. Next one is set default encoding UTF-8. This configuration sets the default encoding error message properties, ensuring that message properties are interpreted with the UTF-8 encoding suitable for handling various character sets. Now let's see why use it in employee service. The message source bean is typically employed in situations where there is a necessity to retrieve localized error messages, validation error messages, or any user-facing messages within the application. In the context of employee service, it can be used to retrieve error messages associated with database interactions. For instance, when an employee is not found in the database, you can retrieve the message record not found in the database from the message source. By adapting the message source, you can decouple error messages from your code base, simplifying the process of maintaining and customizing messages for different languages or specific application requirements. It enhances the internationalization and customization capabilities of your application, rendering it more user-friendly and adaptable to diverse contexts. In summary, the message source empowers you to centralize and manage messages in a flexible and maintainable manner, which proves particularly valuable for handling exceptions and delivering informative error messages within your service layer. In this JU test class for employee service, we harness the power of Mockito to effectively test the find employee by ID method. While we will delve into the details of the test find employee by ID underscore not found scenario, which addresses what happens when an employee is not found, it is important to note that we have crafted a comprehensive suite of test cases to ensure the robustness of our testing. These test cases includes test find employee by ID underscore success, test find employee by ID underscore invalid input, test find employee by ID underscore database error, and test find employee by ID underscore other exception. By exploring these test cases, we guarantee that our find employee by ID method is resilient and responds correctly to various situations. Now let's talk about subscribing. If you found this tutorial helpful and want to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to our channel. Subscribing helps us continue creating valuable tutorials and you will stay updated with our latest videos. Just click the subscribe button below the video and don't forget to hit the notification bell icon so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching and I hope this tutorial has been helpful.